All right. Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and jump into our third lecture in our series of 4 lectures on narrative reviews. Like our preceding lectures, we're going to start off with a little bit of a review of our previous few weeks, just so we start off on the same page. At this point, you're probably very sick of seeing this pyramid, although hopefully you have it memorized as well, or have a good sense of really the meaning behind it. And of course, at the top of the pyramid, as we've been talking about, we have the Cochrane and the systematic reviews, which are very strict recipes the researcher needs to follow in order to conduct these reviews in a proper manner. And as we go down the pyramid, as we've been discussing, we find the scoping review and the narrative review. And the beauty of these reviews, which we're going to jump into almost immediately today, being that the researcher has a lot more ability as the method dictates to select the research that they choose to review versus having to look at the research systematically or exhaustively, which has to be done in the review types at the top of the pyramid. So for narrative reviews in particular, as we've been discussing, that's really the sweet spot because the researcher gets to say, well, this is what I'm going to include and this is what I'm going to exclude. And that's actually what we're going to jump into immediately today. And that's where we left off last week as well. But before we do that, again, just a reminder that the review types and when you are reviewing other research that's already been done, that's termed secondary research or essentially desk research. Research that can be done from your desk without actually having to go into the field to gather original data. So that's secondary research. And then last week, we briefly looked at this pyramid as well, which again, we're not going to go into in great detail because it's not the focus, but just to complement that secondary research pyramid, we have something called a primary research pyramid, which again, at the top, we have the most rigorous methodological experiment types. Thinking through randomized control trials, for instance, are really considered to be the gold standard, where patients, for instance, are randomized into different conditions. So a control condition, for instance, versus an intervention or a treatment condition. You may have heard the term double-blind or randomized controlled trials, double-blind, and that simply implies that neither the researcher actually nor the subject, the patient, neither one of those is aware of which condition they're in, if they're in the control condition or they're in the intervention condition. So that's considered the gold standard when you go out and you gather data in the real world. And then as we go down the pyramid in the same extent that we did for the secondary research pyramid, those rules and that recipe about how to do that particular experiment type, they loosen up a little bit. So when you do an RCT, randomized control trial, you don't have a ton of room to maneuver when it comes to the methods necessarily. However, when you do interventional studies, so maybe you're comparing one intervention for hypertension versus another intervention, you should also include a control group, or observational, for instance, where you're simply observing the outcomes of potentially one particular type of intervention. You can see as we go down the pyramid that the rigor that goes into the particular methods isn't quite as extreme as it is at the top of the pyramid. And then a case study towards the bottom there, case studies tend to be kind of observational, or they tend to look at only one or two different subjects, meaning patients, again, at a time. And so again, you'll see at the top of the pyramid for primary research, just like we have at the top of the pyramid for secondary research, those methods at the top are extremely rigorous and extremely time and resource consuming, which is fantastic. We need to be able to do research like that. But if we want to look into other issues or understand what's going on, certainly these other research types offer a way to do that without as much rigor and time and investment. And so that's our quick review of secondary research and those primary research pyramids. We've been talking about in previous lectures, why do we do that narrative review? And that is just one of the exact reasons why, because it gives the researcher that ability to dictate, I want to include this, I want to exclude that, and so on. And we know from just the past couple of decades, there's been a ton of research that's been published. It's really hard to read those primary research papers, which means that review papers, like narrative review papers, have become a lot more important because it's so hard to keep up with all of the data coming out all of the time. I think I mentioned last week, I still have a few alerts from journals that are active since I did my PhD a while ago, and I find it nearly impossible to keep up even with one or two alerts because there's constantly things being published every single day. And so that's simply just narrating what's on this slide without the wall of text, as you have all seen this slide before. But really, that's the beauty of the narrative review, is you enable others, including yourself, to understand what's going on in a particular body of research without having to do a particularly rigorous systematic review, for instance. And as everyone here is very busy, certainly these review types and narrative reviews are great tools to be able to get your peers and yourself up to speed on what's going on in a particular area. And so again, as we're going to jump into in a second, why do we do narrative reviews specifically? Unlike the reviews at the top of the pyramid, they're more accessible, honestly. And so in our first lecture, skipping back a few weeks, we talked about defining a research question. We won't spend very much time here today. You'll remember there were a few different levers that you can start to think of when you are coming up with a research question that you want to explore. And so you don't need to have each one of these levers or parameters identified. However, it can be helpful to, at least as you come up with your first few research questions and you do your first few reviews, it can be helpful to reference these particular, I keep calling them levers, but really they're different elements that might pop up in your research question, whether that be a specific target population, a specific intervention, or a specific comparison. Again, you can see that you don't necessarily need to have each one of these checked off. However, it can be helpful, and you may, as we've been talking about last week, you may go to search the databases and realize, well, I'm getting millions of records back. I should probably identify a more specific target population if you already identified one, or if you haven't identified one, just to identify one in the first place. We talked as well in our very first lecture, again, about a few frameworks that can help you do this as well. They can help make sure that you have a few different anchor points in your research question. Anchor points meaning that population or intervention. Do you have these different things identified? And the frameworks can help you identify those as well. And then in lecture 2, we jumped into, once we have that research question in place, what is the next step then? How do we get from our research question ultimately into searching each one of the databases? And so we spent all last week talking through search terms, so coming up with different terms or keywords. And if you'll remember, I narrated that it's especially important to think about when you're going into the database to do your search. I think the best metaphor I have is to think about it almost as fishing, not the nefarious kind, the actual kind. And so if you can cast your net as wide as possible, you're least likely to almost accidentally, honestly, inject bias into your review. So you're trying to cast your net when you go searching in the database as wide as possible. And you do that by identifying as many different keywords as possible. You want to be able to speak the language of other potential researchers who might have a different background or who might be working in a different department. You want to make sure that you're all speaking the same language, so you might need to go borrow some of their keywords, which which mean the same thing as what you use. You just use different words because you're in different departments. So those were search terms. We also talked about a few different, more sophisticated strategies, things like wildcards and truncation, which accommodate the fact that there might be spelling differences or there might be ends of the words that are different. And what wildcard, which you can see with the example of ageism and the question mark in the middle, accounts for spelling differences in the middle of the word. Whereas chemotherapy is an example of truncation, if you'll remember, by simply putting an asterisk at the end of the word, you no longer actually have to tell the database, well, I want you to search, sorry, by putting the asterisk at the end of the word, you no longer have to type in each one of the potential different endings to that word. So you see, we might have chemotherapy, chemotherapist, chemotherapies. There are a whole bunch of different potential endings to that word. And you don't know which specific ending is going to end up being flagged in which paper. And so by putting that asterisk at the end, you're simply saying to the database, find anything that you can find with this root, and then it doesn't really matter what comes after the asterisk. Just pull everything that has this chemotherapy without the Y, chemotherapy, as the root in the database. And then finally, at the end, you'll see that mechanism of action is in double quotations. And that's simply what phrase searching is. And as we've been talking about, phrase searching is simply highlighting the importance of including those double quotations around your keywords, or your key term, I should say, I guess. If you don't include those double quotations, the database simply thinks that you're saying, okay, search for the word mechanism, and search for the word of, and search for the word action. And you can see that we're going to pull a million different research records from a million different areas that are focusing on actions, that are focusing on mechanisms, but none of them might actually focus on mechanism of action. So all that to say, remember to use double quotations if you find that you are getting results that are returned that are completely off-piste for you. Make sure that you haven't forgotten to use double quotations on any of your keywords. That could very well happen and should be fairly obvious when it does. So those were our search terms. We also talked about a few different operators. There are plenty of operators available. We talked about or, and, or not. And those operators will get you quite far, if not as far as you need to go. I did link to another resource in lecture 2 if you want to go a little bit deeper on that. However, or, and, or not will get you really quite far. And we talked about also combining those terms in the operators, ultimately to yield something called search strings. So we end up with something like keyword and, keyword or, and so on, depending on the search operators that we're using. And then finally, search strategy is something we talked about thinking about search strategy from a very holistic standpoint. Last week, we may not have talked about it a terrible amount, but this week we will. And that's really documenting and making sure your keywords are documented. If you were doing a systematic review, all of this documentation would need to be extremely rigorous and probably provided for publication. Narrative reviews are a little bit different, but it's still a very, very good idea to have strong documentation. I think last week, the example I gave was you might be going down one of the databases and reading, and if you find other articles that are of interest to you, you might not remember, oh, did I decide to include this or exclude this? I can't remember. And then it can get very confusing. So document your keywords, document your inclusion and exclusion criteria, which we'll jump into in a second. And of course, document the databases that you're searching and typically other elements like the date that you searched it and so on. And we're about to jump into inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then identifying bias, we'll talk a little bit more today, and then in our next lecture next week as well. Last week, we wanted to make sure to emphasize, searching is an iterative process. I think it also does depend on how familiar you are with a certain field. If you are able to sit down out of the gates, maybe you're an expert already in the field and come up with a broad constellation of keywords immediately, your iterative process might be slightly shorter. However, if you are relatively newer to either research or to the topic that you're researching, it's very natural and normal for it to take a few different iterations to find the appropriate keywords and ultimately go back and restarting your search. Something like this, you'll carry out your search, maybe you'll find some papers that are using words that you hadn't thought about before. You'll add those to your keyword list and ultimately keep searching. So you'll end up with something that looks like this, which looks very tiring, but it's not. Ultimately, it's in the aim of casting that net, again, as wide as possible. If you only cast your net in one portion of each database because that's the portion you know of, certainly you're going to be omitting a whole bunch of other very valid potential research that you should be reviewing. All right, so looking at the slide that we have on screen right now, you can see that we've defined our research question, we've come up with our search terms, and we've looked or searched the literature, searched the databases. But now what do we do now that we're sitting here with the research in front of us? Well, really, prior to the research sitting in front of us, what we should have already decided on were inclusion and exclusion criteria. So a few examples just to illustrate out of the gates for inclusion and exclusion criteria are, again, we talked very quickly about these at the end of last week's lecture, but things like language, knowing that a large proportion of peer-reviewed research is published in English. Many times you opt to include English. However, if you're going to opt to not include English language, again, think through the ramifications. And so that's, again, while inclusion and exclusion criteria are the kind of the beauty and the sweet spot of the narrative review, you need to think through the ramifications or the implications of what happens when you do choose to exclude something. So if you chose to exclude all English language articles, which you very likely won't do, but you can think about the fact that you would be omitting a massive body of research, and what does that say? How is that going to make your review more or less impactful or useful to the reader? Time frame is another one. We talked in the very first lecture, and probably again last week, about time frame, and usually in narrative reviews, a 5 to 10 year look back tends to be suitable. So thinking it's 2025 now, searching the databases to 2020 or 2015 is probably suitable. However, as we talked about last week, remembering, we had a massive global event in 2020 and surrounding years. So depending on what your subject type is, you'll need to take that into account. If you are studying something that's focused on hospital care or something like that, you certainly want to take into account, well, there was different behavior pre-2020, and then we probably had a few years where the behavior was wildly different, and now we might be settling in, again, to even different behavior and operationalizations of how we deliver clinical care. So again, that 5 to 10 years is usually a good rule of thumb, but think through why you might need to probably lengthen that duration depending on the topic at hand. Language is, geographic location is very similar to language. Again, you are more than capable of omitting different geographic locations. However, think through, again, what happens to your review and the readers of your review if you choose to omit that particular language or region. What if they are interested in that region, or maybe there is a good reason to omit it because that region does something completely different, for instance. Again, just think through everything critically and carefully. Format is another one. Last week we talked about why I was saying the terms research records versus research papers, and we dug into the fact that beyond research papers, which you can use in your narrative review, there are other elements or research types that you might want to include, like reports from public companies, or conference abstracts, or preprints, so meaning papers that will very likely be published through peer-reviewed, but have not come out yet. So thinking through, do I only want to publish what is accessible via peer-reviewed journal articles, or am I more willing to grab research from other disparate sources as well? The same thing, or similarly, with types of research. So if you'll remember our primary research pyramid, are you okay with having data from all of those different experiment types? Or are you only focused on randomized control trials because they happen to be the most rigorous type of data gathering for your subject? That is another opportunity for you to say, this is what I want to include, and again, this is what I want to exclude. And just, again, being sure to justify, do you have a rationale, or is it your rationale that it's too hard, or I don't have time, or something else? Make sure that you're honest with yourself in your rationale and how it's ultimately going to affect the underlying value of the narrative review that you end up based on the choices that you're making. So you'll see we have an example. We looked at this research question last week in order to derive our particular keywords. However, if we look at it now, we can look at the different inclusion and exclusion criteria that the researcher has opted to go with. So at the top, you'll see we have the population, and they've identified undergraduate students in medical health sciences fields. So inherently, they're excluding everyone who is not an undergraduate student in those fields. And the same thing applies for intervention. They are only focused on generative AI, LLMs, in education or assessment. So it doesn't matter if the generative AI LLM is in another domain. It has to be relevant to education. The same thing, they've identified inclusion criteria for the comparator and the outcome. And you'll see if we skip down to the second row from the bottom, they've identified exclusion criteria, which is that they've decided they're going to exclude preprints. So perhaps they feel like the research should be formally published in the peer-reviewed journal, since it might be withdrawn or it might be changed before it ends up being printed in that peer-reviewed journal. It's very unlikely those things happen. It just happens to be a choice that this researcher has made. There's some examples, and here are a few more examples. On the left, under inclusion criteria, you'll see that there's a time bound that this researcher has used. They said, I am only interested in English language articles between January 1st, 2015 and 31st, 2020. In exclusion criteria, you can see that they are interested in commentaries and conference abstracts and editorials and posters, and really the whole gamut, or those are exclusion. So they're actually not interested in any of those things whatsoever. Like the previous paper, it's very possible that they're only focused on peer-reviewed studies. And yet another example, just to hammer home the different dimensions that researchers choose to include and exclude based on. Again, you can see their population here, patients with COPD. They need to be above 18. They can be any gender, though. And then the paper needs to include data identifying support needs in patients with COPD. And the support needs are identified by patients with COPD. So you can see that their inclusion and exclusion criteria is a little bit more nuanced than the previous examples that we've given, because of these specific, very specific criteria relating to their research question. So they're interested in support needs, and they've established an inclusion and exclusion criteria around that particular topic. So we'll jump into these visuals in a second, but I wanted to show this here to illustrate and bring a visual to essentially what we've been talking about. If you'll see at the top, the researcher is identifying all of the records that they found through their database searching, which is a little bit over 4,000. And then as they've gone through their review, and they've gone through their review, and in the box on the bottom right, they've started to exclude things based on their inclusion and exclusion criteria. Ultimately, they end up with the articles included in the narrative review, which is the middle box at the bottom. So on the far right, at the bottom, you can see that they excluded articles that didn't use HPT in their framework, HPT framework in their analysis. They didn't want to include those. They excluded conference abstracts and commentaries and thesis dissertations. So those were all their exclusion criteria, and this is simply adding a visual to that search strategy. And you'll remember a few slides ago, I said document, document, document. This is a fantastic way to document what you are doing in a more visual manner. All right. So when you are sitting there and you have your inclusion and exclusion criteria already established as you are going through all of the papers that are in front of you, I highly recommend reviewing sources and the research that you have in front of you in a reverse chronological order, meaning you're going through the most recent publications or research, and then you're working your way backwards in time. And the reason behind this is that if there are older seminal or foundational papers, so to speak, that are published beyond your 5 to 10 year look back period, if they are, in fact, that foundational, they're going to be continually cited in papers that are even newer date-wise. So even those recently published papers tend to usually reference extremely important papers that were done 20 or 30 years ago. They'll still have references to those. So you won't miss out on the most important research that's done a long time ago simply by going newest to oldest. Depending on how familiar you are with the topic, it's going to be slow, relatively slower at the start. It's going to be much slower if you're not familiar, and you might be totally fine if you are familiar with the subject. But as you work your way backwards, so you start with the latest and greatest in the field, and then you work your way backwards, you're going to start to get faster and faster as you go through each progressive paper or each document over time. And that's just because you'll already be familiar with the more foundational concepts that are being introduced as you go back in time and through the older sources. And again, you might have already read some of those major contributions of those much older papers in the newer ones because they are very foundational and they serve to essentially set the stage for the newer research that you're starting with. So drafting the review or drafting your narrative review rarely follows a linear pathway. And what I mean by that is rarely do you search the databases and then go through the materials and then you sit down at your desk and you start by typing introduction, methods, kind of going linearly through the review. It almost never works that way. Typically where you start is start where you are, which that phrase equally applies here. Your starting point is where the data is retrieved. In typically visuals and figures, or you might have Word documents and things like that, but tends to be very helpful if you can make it more visual than not. Ultimately, these are really kind of the cornerstones of the review, and if you can have a very helpful visual, it often will be included in the publication as well, so that the readers can also see how you extracted the data and how you were thinking about the body of research that you reviewed. So as you're going through, we'll look at a few of those visual examples in a second, But as you're going through the different papers and the posters or abstracts and documents, reports, what have you, you're thinking, what is the story that the literature is telling me? Were their hypotheses? What did they find? What methods were they using? And does that all make sense to me? Would I have expected a different outcome based on the methods that they chose or based on the paper that I just read? These are notes that you should be taking as you're thinking and as you're going through each one of those research documents. As well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the studies you reviewed? Last week, we talked about the fact that, just like everything in life, when you go to do research, you make a plan. You have a plan for how long you're going to run your experiment and who is going to be in it and what the treatment conditions are going to be. However, again, just rarely like things in life, they don't always turn out exactly how you want them to be. So very often in primary research, when you're going out into the field to gather this data, very often things execute or implement exactly how you intended them to be. Typically, you're going to have shorter time horizons than you wanted, or maybe one of your trials isn't going to have as many patients as you wanted it to have, or something like that. And so there are inherent strengths and weaknesses to many of the studies that you'll be reviewing as you do your narrative review. It's just a matter of doing research in the real world. Also, while you're going through the research that you've pulled from the database, you're thinking through, well, how and why do these different documents and research papers, how are they actually contributing to advancing knowledge in this area? What did this paper contribute, and what is this poster contributing, and how are they different? How are they building on one another? Also, what research questions, what other research needs to be done? Are you thinking about questions as you're reading through each one of the research records? And are you waiting to see if someone is going to answer it? And if no one has answered it in the body of research that you've pulled in your search, then maybe there is a gap in the literature, and maybe you've identified a question that other research needs to go after and gather data on so that we can better understand. And also, what are the implications for policy and or practical considerations? So thinking through, what are these different papers finding? Are they finding all of the same thing? Are they finding very strong effects, for instance, which tell us that maybe we actually shouldn't be approaching this group of patients like this at all? This is currently the gold standard of care, but maybe based on what I'm finding in my research, I'm actually very interested, or it feels compelling to go after this other line of care as well. So maybe there are potential implications that you're identifying as well. And then finally, well, not finally, but as you're going through, I mean, don't lose sight of your North Star, which is really your research question. And so how are each individual record, how is each individual record helping you answer your research question? And certainly they're not all going to have the same impact or have the same relevancy to your research question, but how are the different records that you've pulled ultimately answering that question that you started with? All right, so we talked about screening some articles and selecting them based on inclusion and exclusion criteria. And now we're going to look at a few more of those visual examples around extracting data from what you're reading. So as you're reading, you're thinking through these questions, but at the same time as you're reading, you probably don't want to just do reading. You probably want to take notes or extract information into a visual fashion as well. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back and keep reading the original documents over and over again. So this can be a very helpful strategy to help save time and be more efficient in your review as well. So jumping to this table offers you an example of a data extraction table where the researcher has decided they're going to extract the information from their different research records. And they're going to put it into a table like the one we see on the screen with the columns essentially across the top. So this is a very kind of summary level table where the author is at the top, and then they have the aim and the subjects or the participants, the study design and the intervention, outcomes and results, and so on. And so you can see this is plainly a summary, which can be very useful for not having to go back to remember, well, what did Adefila and et al. Find in their study? I can't remember. I need to go back to the results section. I need to find that page. It can be very time consuming and a little bit annoying. So by doing yourself a favor and extracting this information into a helpful table like this, you'll end up saving a lot of time. Now, the table that we have here is slightly different. So this table, we were extracting data really for summary purposes. Here, however, we see that the table is for thematic analysis, meaning the researcher was interested in figuring out which papers or which research records mention particular themes. So the best practice activity column on the left identifies a whole bunch of themes that the researcher was interested in. And then in the middle column, article references, they've linked, or they've hyperlinked rather, to the different references that include those themes. And then finally on the far right, you'll see the N, or the percentage of their overall research sample that includes that particular theme. And so you'll see at the top, there's an N of 27 or 49% on the top right of articles include training and education of researchers and patients. And so that is obviously a very important theme. And that is how this particular researcher has elected to pull out and showcase the relative importance of different themes in this research area. So this is simply one option available to you to help tell your reader, well, here's what I found. Here is the relative frequency of each one of these themes being mentioned. And this researcher has taken a slightly different, extremely poor screenshot. That is my fault, but we'll talk through it. This is also a thematic analysis of sorts. In this case, the themes are down the left-hand side. So here they were in this table. Here they're also on the left side here. However, instead of enumerating each one of the articles or records like this, they've instead put each record across the top, and they're simply indicating through a checkbox, this is where that theme occurs. So it's a visual in a slightly different manner, but really the purpose of showing you these different visuals is ultimately to show you that it's up to you to decide how best to communicate with your reader visually. This particular visual, if we're being totally honest, I don't find tremendously helpful unless there is that summary column at the end, like there was here. Otherwise here, I'm staring at this and I'm trying to figure out where are the most check marks. Probably health literacy down here, altruism. Again, you can see how this is harder for the reader. So depending on your topic and what you're finding and what the goal of your review is, think critically about how to display or visually display that information to your reader. And again, this researcher has chosen yet another different type of table to showcase the information that they've extracted to their reader. So in this case, they've put themes across the top, unlike our previous examples where themes were across the left-hand side. They put the themes across the top, and then the researchers or the papers and articles down the left side. So again, just highlighting the fact that it's up to you, especially as narrative, that's the beauty of the narrative review. It's up to you to figure out what is the most impactful way to summarize this data and convey it to my reader. All right, so we talked about going from newest to oldest, that 5 to 10 year look back, again, really depending on your research question, keeping 2020 in mind, etc. We talked about extracting data. So we had that summary table where the researcher had pulled out the the subjects and the interventions, and they've really gone through each section of each paper very systematically. You can extract data for summary purposes, but you can also, as we've just been looking at, you can extract data for thematic purposes or analysis by choosing to pull out different themes or different parts of the research to highlight those to the reader. Oh dear. So on top of that summary piece, the beauty of the narrative review, which we've been talking about in our lecture up until now, has really been this critical appraisal piece. So the summary piece is great. There are summary pieces, summarization is really table stakes. We've been talking about this. I'm not going to try to beat around the bush saying, please do all of your summarizing manually. However, it's the critical part and the critical appraisal part is really where there's a lot more nuance to appreciate. And the more that you know about a particular topic, the stronger your critical appraisal is going to be. And ultimately, the more impactful your review is going to be because you've injected into your review this very particular critical piece that's coming from what you know and how it applies to what you are reviewing. And so the summary is simply what is each record finding, what are the main findings, and how do they relate? The critical appraisal piece is, well, the summary looks like this, but why does the summary look like that? Why do the different research records in my summary, why do they have different results? Or why do they have conflicting results? And so that is where the critical appraisal piece comes in. And you can start to conjecture, well, how might the methods, for instance, knowing not all research is executed exactly how you want it to, how might some of the methods in the papers that I've been reviewing affected the outcomes that those researchers found? Did those researchers run their trial as long as they did? Oh, no, they didn't. I can see they wanted to do a 10-month trial, but they only did a 5-month trial. Maybe that's why their outcome is different from these other researchers who did a year-long trial. So you can see the more kind of contextual nuance that you have about a particular subject area, particularly that patient group or those therapeutic areas and things like that, the more nuanced appreciation you have, the more detailed that critical appraisal can start to be. You're able to make more specific and more detailed hypotheses about why that summary doesn't look how you thought it would, or all the results don't line up how you thought they would. And ultimately, that is the kind of gift that you are giving to your reader. You're saying, I looked at this body of research, here's what I found, but also here's why it looks this way. Not only am I going to tell you about my day, I'm going to tell you about how I feel about my day as well, if that's a helpful analogy for you. Oh dear. So, as I was just saying, in relation to primary research, all research is limited by weaknesses and flaws, the evidence, meaning of the methods that they had to use to gather that data firsthand. And it's up to you as the reviewer not to say, oh, well, I'm sorry that you had to run a shorter trial with fewer subjects. No, that's up to you while you're doing your review to say, well, here I am hypothesizing as an expert or pseudo expert that had this trial actually run longer, it's very possible that they would have found comparable outcomes to maybe XYZ other paper that you also reviewed. And so in general, as you're going through the research records and you're making your tables and your visual extractions of the data that's in those papers, you should be thinking about the key results. So what are they finding? What did that primary research find? What were their limitations? Whether or not a trial was run for as long as they wanted to, or they had fewer subjects than they wanted to. Those things should already be called out in the primary research limitation section of those papers, if they are papers. Again, peer-reviewed papers will have those. Other times you might have to kind of detective out those limitations yourself if they're not already called out. While you're doing your critical assessment, going through your papers and research records, thinking about, were the methods that were used, were they suitable to test the original hypothesis? So if you were going to go out and answer the same question the researcher did in the paper that you're reading, would you have also used the same methods they did? If not, why? And that is certainly a welcome topic for you to discuss in your narrative review. If you would have used different methods, why? Tell your reader. Tell them why you think the methods the researcher chose were maybe suboptimal and why another way might have been preferable. That is completely fair game. Quality of the results is something that you're going to hear a lot about when it comes to systematic reviews. There's a heavy focus on the quality of the research. Could mean a whole bunch of different things that we're not necessarily going to get into here, but if you take a very kind of high-level example and think about quality, meaning a paper that I got from Google Scholar and it's not peer-reviewed and maybe someone wrote it 10 years ago, versus an randomized control trial that was run at a very prominent academic center, you can see that there is a potential quality disparity between those two papers. You don't know if the one that you found on Google Scholar was done with the same rigor, meaning the same kind of objectiveness. Was the researcher aware of who was assigned to what condition? Again, were they, I don't know where I'm going with this, but all that to say, I wouldn't worry too much about quality for their narrative review, but if it does come up in conversation or you do read about it, it tends to be the focus for systematic reviews, but you always want to be, just like everything in life, aiming for relatively high quality of research in your narrative review as well. And what that means really is making sure you're being diligent in vetting your sources, where you're getting the primary research that you are reviewing. And then just like you are able to say, well, I would have used different methods to investigate that research question that this researcher used, you can also say, well, I don't actually fully agree with the way they've interpreted the results that they found. That is also part of doing a narrative review, is you have the ability to critique the interpretation, or to offer, rather, a different interpretation of what they've found. And again, just feel free to appropriately, certainly appropriately being the key word here, critique study design and disagree with generated conclusions. That's all part of a kind of healthy academic and healthy research environment, is being able to hypothesize why some research turned out the way it did, why some methods yielded the outcomes they did, and then thinking, as we move forward and do more research in that area, how can we take what we've learned and keep moving it forward? And so part of that involves looking critically at what we've already done so that we can know what to do moving forward. And something I want to stress, which I know we do subconsciously a lot, and this is something that as a behavioral person I feel very passionate about, is when you are going through the evidence, even when you are picking out which articles via your inclusion and exclusion criteria that you're going to use in your review, do your best to try to avoid being what I call an intuitive lawyer rather than a scientist. And what I mean by this is that lawyers concoct arguments based on a set of facts that they have. They have a bunch of different data points and they line them up in a way to make an argument that they ultimately want to land on. That is what a lawyer does. That is not what a scientist does. A scientist does not have an end argument that they ultimately want to make. They want to look objectively at each one of those data points without an end goal in mind necessarily. And so ultimately, what I'm trying to say is, don't omit any evidence or don't say, well, I don't know if I'm going to include this paper. It's going to make things more difficult because it doesn't quite line up with the results, or the methods don't quite line up as nicely with the rest of the body that I'm looking at. Those sorts of things. Don't omit evidence when you're trying to make a case for a particular position or because it's easier for whatever reason. Ultimately, you want to make sure you're maintaining that scientific method and not going too into that intuitive lawyer, this is the end goal I want to achieve. And that can be more commonplace when you've published in particular areas and you've found particular effects. It can be very compelling to want to find research that supports what you've already found. However, do your best to maintain that objective rigor and that scientific viewpoint that there is no end goal or end argument that I'm trying to make to satisfy my ego or what have you. Ultimately, I'm going to look at each research record independently and with its own value associated with it. So you're not selectively critique. You're probably thinking this is very obvious already. However, we do things that we don't mean to all the time. In one helpful strategy, if you do find, well, everything is agreeing with what I thought, that's very great. I am being very objective. Something you can do is, if you feel compelled, is searching for counter examples, just doing a quick search in one of the databases or in Google Scholar, things like that. I can help you make sure that you just weren't being consciously or subconsciously blind or avoidant to a particular body of work. So we're going to jump into this at the start of next week around writing. As we talked about in this lecture, writing up your narrative review does not follow a linear pathway. We didn't start with writing with the introduction once we were done reading the research. Today we talked about actually starting where we were, down with those data extraction tables and the thematic analysis. We're going to start where we are, which is really in the weeds of where did we get the research that we're reviewing, and also what are we finding as we review it. And so next week, as we start our lecture, we'll be talking about writing. We'll start with writing the methods and really, how did you undertake the review? What keywords did you use? So you'll see describe search strategy. We talked about our search strategy being search terms and search operators and search strings and all of those things. So those are things you'll want to include in your methods for your paper. So you'll need to have those documented. Haha, if they're already documented, it's really, really easy. How did you find what you were reviewing? What databases did you use? What inclusion and exclusion criteria did you use? What software? It's probably unlikely you use software. It's far more common for primary research. You might use a statistical package or a qualitative analysis package. But for narrative reviews in particular, it's probably unlikely. And then finally, at the bottom, as we've been talking about today, did you use a structured mode of analysis? Were you pulling out themes? Did you extract data from all of the papers simply for a summarization purpose? All of those sorts of things. All right, we're going to cover this at the start of next lecture. So next week, again, we'll start with those methods. And then what we'll end up doing is we'll go from methods down towards the bottom of the paper. So what did we find? What do we think about what we found, which is the discussion? And then from there, we're going to zoom all the way back up to the top of the paper. So we'll go methods and results, discussion, and then we'll jump back up to the introduction. That's what we're going to cover next week. There's my really awful joke for this week. Sorry, or you're welcome, whichever one you want. And I look forward to seeing everyone next week, where we'll really finally go through that entire narrative review from methods and then introduction, and we'll have everything all set to go. So I hope everyone has a good week. Next week, we'll talk about writing up the entire manuscript, and I look forward to seeing you there. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.